It was supposed to be the happiest day. My birthday. The table was filled with food, balloons floating above us, relatives smiling, and I thought it would be a night of laughter and love. But instead of hugs or kind words, my parents chose that moment to humiliate me. In front of everyone, across the dinner table, they raised their voices and told me I had to start paying $2,000 rent or get out of their house immediately. The words felt like knives. The room went silent. Guests froze with forks halfway to their mouths, and then came the whispers, small, sharp sounds that cut through the air. I looked down at my plate, and the food that had seemed so warm and comforting only minutes before now felt like poison sitting in front of me. My chest was tight, my face burned, but I refused to let them see me break. This was supposed to be a celebration of my life, yet my own parents turned it into a stage to shame me. I wanted to scream, to ask them why, to remind them that this was my birthday. But instead, I sat there in the thick silence, listening to the uneasy shifting of chairs, the clinking of glasses, the coughs people made to fill the space where laughter should have been. That night, I realized the celebration wasn't about love or family at all. It was a performance, and I was the one being sacrificed in the spotlight. For as long as I can remember, I had been swallowing little hurts from my parents, telling myself it was normal, that maybe I was overreacting. They always treated my brother like the golden child. He could make mistakes, fail classes, lose money, and somehow it would always be forgiven, brushed under the rug, even excused as, he's just figuring things out. But with me, it was never the same. Every small step I took was picked apart, every success downplayed, and every mistake used as proof that I wasn't enough. I kept quiet because I didn't want to be the bitter one, the complainer in the family. I thought maybe if I worked harder, helped more, gave more, they would finally see me as worthy. Then came the constant demands for money. No matter how much I gave, it was never enough. They always had a new reason, a new bill, a new emergency that needed my paycheck. And even when I gave, there was no gratitude, just more expectations. If I hesitated, even for a moment, I was guilted into believing I was ungrateful, selfish, or disrespectful. Slowly, I felt like my entire identity was reduced to being their personal ATM. But what hurt the most wasn't the money. It was the way they chipped away at me with little comments. Jokes that weren't jokes. Backhanded compliments. Questions asked in front of others to make me feel small. When are you going to settle down? Why don't you have what your brother has? Are you really proud of that? Each word was like a tiny pin, and over the years, I just let them sink in, pretending it didn't bother me. That night, though, the night of the birthday ambush, it became clear that this wasn't just about rent. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. It was about reminding me that no matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, they believed I would always owe them. That I should be grateful just to exist under their roof. And they chose to make that point by tearing me down in front of everyone I loved, making sure I felt small, cornered, and humiliated. Something inside me shifted in that moment. I realized this wasn't a one-time thing. It was the last straw in a long chain of moments where they had pushed me down and expected me to smile through it. I wasn't crazy for feeling the imbalance, I wasn't weak for noticing the favoritism, and I wasn't selfish for wanting respect. I finally saw the truth: they didn't want rent. They wanted power. They wanted to keep me under their thumb, dependent and ashamed. And that realization burned away the guilt I had carried for years. Instead of shame, I felt clarity. I wasn't going to give them what they wanted anymore. I wasn't going to keep pretending that this was love. That night, I stopped being their scapegoat, their provider, their easy target. That night, I decided it was the end of their control over me. When I pushed my chair back from the table, I could feel every eye in the room on me. Some were waiting for me to break down, to cry, to beg my parents not to do this on my birthday. Others looked away, too uncomfortable to meet my gaze, whispering to each other about how embarrassing this was. My parents were sure they had me cornered. They even had a printed agreement ready for me to sign, as if I would put my name on a paper that made me a prisoner in their own home. They thought humiliation would force me into obedience. They thought I would crumble like I always did, that I would trade my dignity for a roof over my head. But I didn't. I didn't scream or argue or let tears fall in front of them. I stayed calm, even though inside my chest was burning. I pushed my plate away, the food I could no longer touch, and stood up. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My face wasn't red with shame. For the first time in years, I felt steady, almost light. I walked past the balloons, past the whispers, past the people who didn't know whether to stop me or stay silent. I didn't even glance back at my parents because I knew what I would see, satisfaction on their faces, convinced they had finally broken me. But the truth was, that walk out of the house wasn't defeat. It was freedom. I left with no suitcase, no plan, no money in my hand, but I carried something much more powerful, dignity. They thought they had taken everything from me, but what they didn't know was that when you lose everything, you have nothing left to fear. I stepped out of the house into the cool night air, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe without permission. I didn't know where I would sleep that night. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I was done letting them control me. I was done living under their rules, done carrying the weight of their expectations, done paying for the privilege of being their child. Every step I took away from that house felt like a step toward myself, toward the life I deserved but was too afraid to claim. That night could have ended with me signing their paper, begging for forgiveness, or agreeing to conditions that would have killed my spirit. Instead, it ended with me walking out into the unknown with nothing but my dignity intact. And what looked like the end of everything to them was really the beginning of my story. Because when you walk out with nothing, you learn how to build everything. That night, they thought they had won. But in reality, that was the moment I truly began to live. When I walked out of my parents' house, I didn't have much. Just a small bag, a little bit of savings, and the heavy silence of knowing I couldn't go back. For a moment, fear almost swallowed me whole. Where would I sleep? How would I eat? How would I survive without a safety net? But instead of panicking, I made a promise to myself: I wasn't going to beg, I wasn't going to borrow, and I wasn't going to let this break me. If they thought pushing me out would leave me helpless, they were wrong. That night, I decided to live differently. I decided to try something radical, what I called a zero-spend life. Zero spend meant I would buy nothing I didn't absolutely need. No random snacks just because I felt like it, no shopping to distract myself, no wasting money on things that didn't matter. Every dollar had to stretch, every choice had to count. It wasn't easy. I slept on couches, in small cheap rooms, sometimes even in places my parents would laugh at if they saw me. But oddly enough, I felt lighter. For the first time, no one could dangle money over my head. No one could tell me I owed them for existing. I started working with what I had. Old clothes became items I could flip online. Skills I once used as favors became services I offered for pay. I began freelancing from noisy cafes, balancing my laptop on tiny tables, buying one coffee and making it last for hours. When I couldn't afford something, I found another way. I bartered skills, exchanged my time, and learned how little I actually needed to live. Each day became a test of creativity. Could I cook with just a handful of cheap ingredients? Could I stretch my energy and focus without expensive comforts? Every challenge turned into proof that I was capable of more than I ever thought. People would probably look at my life then and call it struggle, but I didn't see it that way. To me, it felt like freedom. I wasn't weighed down by things I didn't need, I wasn't running after approval, and I wasn't chained to anyone's conditions. I started to enjoy the simplicity. Waking up and knowing I was surviving on my own gave me strength. Eating food I prepared with pennies tasted better than any fancy dinner that came with humiliation. Falling asleep in small, imperfect spaces felt more peaceful than lying in a big house where love was conditional. My parents would have mocked the places I stayed, the second-hand clothes I wore, the fact that I sometimes counted coins just to get through the day. But what they would never understand is that in those small, difficult days, I felt freer than I ever had under their roof. Zero spend wasn't punishment. It was power. It was the first step in turning survival into strength, and strength into something even bigger. It was the start of me becoming untouchable. At first, I thought my zero-spend life was just about survival. Every day was about making my little savings stretch as far as possible, finding ways to eat, work, and live without falling apart. But slowly, I started noticing something powerful. The very things I was doing to survive were teaching me skills I never would have learned if life had stayed easy. I learned how to cook full meals with just a few coins, how to recycle things most people threw away, and how to stretch every resource until it gave me more than I thought possible. What felt like struggle started to look like strategy. I began to realize that maybe this wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning. One day, almost without thinking, I started writing it all down. I called it my zero-spend diary. I shared how I lived on cents a day, how I made shampoo from kitchen ingredients, how I turned old clothes into items I could sell. I wrote about my failures too, the nights I cried from exhaustion, the meals that went horribly wrong, the days I felt invisible. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just being honest. To my surprise, people began to read it. At first, it was just a few comments, a handful of messages from strangers saying my story inspired them. Then it grew. People wanted to know more. They wanted tips. They wanted to try it themselves. What I thought was just my survival plan started turning into something bigger. My diary became a small online community where people shared their own money-saving tricks, their struggles, their small victories. I wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. Slowly, it turned into a movement. People started tagging me, asking for advice, thanking me for showing them a different way to live. The shame I once carried about being kicked out with nothing transformed into pride. I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was leading. Then came the moment that changed everything. A company reached out, asking if I would share their product with my growing audience. At first, I laughed. Me? The girl who was living off cents, who couldn't even afford to buy new shoes. But they saw what I hadn't yet, I had influence. I had built trust. And that trust was valuable. That first small sponsorship was like a spark. More followed. Soon, I wasn't just running a diary, I was running a brand. What my parents thought would break me actually became my rebirth. They imagined me struggling, begging, regretting my choices. Instead, I was documenting every step of my climb, turning my pain into a blueprint for freedom. What was once humiliation became empowerment, and what was once survival became strategy. The same girl they tried to silence had found her voice, and that voice was reaching thousands. My struggle wasn't a secret anymore. It was my strength, and it was becoming my future. Months after I walked out of that house, my parents were busy telling anyone who would listen that they had taught me a lesson. At family gatherings they bragged about how they forced me into independence, how I finally learned responsibility because of them. They spoke with so much pride, as if pushing me out on my birthday was the greatest gift they had ever given me. They had no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. While they were mocking me, laughing at where I slept or what I ate, my so-called independence was turning into something much bigger, something they could never take credit for. What started as a simple zero-spend diary had grown into a movement. Every day, more people followed my posts. They wanted to know how I stretched $1, how I recycled, how I turned scraps into something useful. They weren't just curious, they were inspired. People who once felt powerless with money were suddenly learning that they didn't need much to live well. My honesty, my struggles, even my embarrassing failures were teaching others, and they trusted me because I was living it for real. Then came the moment I'll never forget. A company emailed me, asking if I would share their product with my audience. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Me, the girl living with almost nothing, being asked to represent a brand. But it wasn't a mistake. They saw the power I didn't yet see in myself. That one opportunity opened the door to another, then another. Soon, sponsorships were pouring in. I was getting paid to share tips, to create content, to do the same things I was already doing every single day. I remember sitting in a cafe one night, laptop open, and realizing that I had just earned more in 1 week than my parents had demanded from me for rent. The irony made me laugh out loud. The same girl they kicked out, the one they thought would come crawling back, was now building a life that didn't just cover her needs, it was creating abundance. Independence wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about influence. My voice was reaching thousands, and soon, millions. And the sweetest part? My parents had no idea. While they bragged about teaching me independence, they didn't know I had become the face of financial freedom across the continent. They didn't know companies were flying me out for events, that people were quoting my words, that my story was turning into a brand worth far more than the rent they once demanded. That was my first taste of revenge, not the bitter, angry kind, but the kind that tastes like victory. I didn't have to shout, I didn't have to prove myself to them directly. My success was speaking louder than I ever could. The girl they thought they had broken was not only standing tall but leading a movement. And for the first time in my life, the power wasn't in their hands. It was in mine. When the next big family gathering came around, I walked in quietly, not looking for attention, just happy to see familiar faces. My parents, however, had a plan. They were parading my brother around like he was the star of the show. He had started a business, and they wanted everyone to know about it. They bragged loudly, telling stories about how smart and ambitious he was, painting him as the shining example of success in the family. They didn't know that most people already knew the truth, that his so-called business was struggling, sinking faster than anyone wanted to admit. I stayed calm, listening, smiling politely. I didn't try to outshine him or correct their stories. I didn't need to. But as the night went on, something unexpected happened. One by one, relatives started pulling me aside. They weren't asking about my brother's business. They were asking about mine. How did you grow your platform so fast? What advice would you give me about saving money? I follow your page every day, it's changed the way I live. Their voices were filled with admiration and curiosity, not pity or judgment. In that moment, I realized my parents weren't the ones writing the story anymore. Everyone could see the truth for themselves. I caught my parents watching from across the room. At first, they looked confused, then uncomfortable. They had spent so long trying to make me small, and now they were watching as people they respected looked at me with more interest than at their golden child. For years, they had treated me like the background character, the one who would never measure up. Now, without paying them a single dollar of rent, without following their rules, I had built something they couldn't ignore, a movement worth millions. I didn't brag. I didn't need to wave my success in their faces. The room spoke for me. Every smile, every question, every relative leaning in to hear my advice was proof of what I had built. And the best part was that it wasn't just about money. It was about impact. I had turned humiliation into a platform, turned survival into strength, and turned strength into influence. People weren't impressed by a fancy business card or a rented office, they were moved by the fact that I had been broken down and still found a way to rise higher than anyone expected. That night was my full circle moment. The same parents who once shouted at me across a table, demanding rent, were now sitting in silence while relatives sought me out for guidance. The same daughter they thought would crawl back defeated had become the one people looked up to most. I didn't need to say a word. The proof was living all around me, in the respect I had earned and the freedom I had built. That night, for the first time, they saw me not as the child they could control but as the woman they could never break. It happened quietly, almost like she had been rehearsing it in her head. My mom looked at me, her voice softer than usual, and asked if I could help out with the house expenses. For a second, I just stared at her, remembering every moment from that birthday night, the shouting, the humiliation, the printed agreement they expected me to sign. I remembered how small they tried to make me feel, how they thought rent would break me. And now here she was, asking me for help as if none of that had ever happened. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply smiled. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you've already won. Then I said the words I had been carrying inside me for months: "You charged me $2,000 rent at a family party. My rent went into building my empire instead." The silence after that was heavy. She didn't know what to say. My dad shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. For once, there were no lectures, no guilt trips, no demands. Just silence. I stood up, calm and steady, and walked toward the door. But this time was different from the first walkout. Back then, I left with nothing, just my dignity. This time, I left with everything: my freedom, my success, my peace. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their house. I didn't even need their love the way I once did. I had built a life they could never take credit for, a life that proved their rent was never the price of my worth. And as I walked out again, I knew this time I wasn't leaving broken. I was leaving complete.